We set out into those mountains hoping to find an elk, but instead we uncovered something that has stayed with me for the last 34 years. It began with 2 hunters, a hidden cave at the top of a narrow draw that no one should ever have stumbled across. Inside, seated cross-legged on a bed of pine boughs beside a small fire, was Connie Hollister. She was 26 years old. She had disappeared in December 1976 at the age of 11 after her father's truck slid off Forest Road 402 during a blizzard that buried the Selkirk Mountains under nearly 3 feet of snow in just 14 hours. Search crews looked for her for 9 days before finally accepting that she was gone. Yet there she was in the fall of 1991, living in a cave above the Priest River drainage, alive, healthy, and not by herself. She had 3 daughters. The oldest looked to be around 8 years old. The youngest had only recently learned to walk. They were her children, her own. And when I later came face to face with the one waiting near the entrance to that cave, everything I believed about the world changed. As daylight faded and the evening cold drifted down from the high country into the bottom of the draw, he stepped into view. He stood 7.5 feet tall, his entire body covered in dark hair from head to foot. He didn't flee when he saw us, and we never lifted our rifles, because Connie Hollister moved between us and spoke a single sentence that has echoed in my mind ever since. She said, "Please don't hurt their father." My name is Glenn Hollis. I'm 76 years old, and I now live alone in a small house outside Sandpoint, Idaho, where I've remained since retiring from the Bonner County Road Department in 1998. My wife, May, passed away in 2009. We never had children. My hunting partner of 41 years, Roy Pickett, died from a heart attack in his garage in 2007. Roy was the only other person who knew what we discovered in that cave, and he carried that knowledge exactly as I did, in silence, with the kind of burden that slowly weighs a man down over the course of a lifetime. On the 3rd evening of our stay, after sharing a meal with Connie's family, sleeping on the cave floor, and watching her oldest daughter weave strands of grass into a cord, with hands already far too strong for an 8-year-old, we made her a promise. We swore we would never tell anyone what we had witnessed unless she gave us permission. 6 months ago, she finally did. A letter arrived in my mailbox, just as it had twice every year since 1992. At the bottom of this one, she wrote that the time had come. Her oldest daughter wanted the story told, and she said I should tell it in whatever way I believe was right. So that's what I'm doing. I'm telling everything I can still remember, as clearly and honestly as I can. Connie Hollister was the only daughter of Earl and Faye Hollister, who operated a small dairy farm on the northern end of Priest Lake. Earl was a quiet, hard-working man whose hands had been broken so many times in farming accidents that his knuckles never looked quite right again. Faye was the gentle one. She taught Sunday school at the small Methodist church in Coolin, and was known for bringing tuna casserole to any family in the county that had lost a loved one, welcomed a new baby, or moved into a new home. They had both married later in life, already in their 30s, and Connie was the only child they were ever blessed with. Everyone who knew Connie remembered her as a happy child. She was small for her age, dark-haired, quick to laugh, and followed her father everywhere around the farm. By 8, she could milk a cow as well as any worker Earl employed. By 10, she could handle a rifle better than most men in the county. something that filled her father with both pride and concern. Earl believed a girl should know how to protect herself, while hoping his daughter would never have to. On December 11th, 1976, Earl Hollister helped Connie into his 1971 Ford F250 and drove up Forest Road 402 into the Selkirk Mountains to cut their Christmas tree. It was an annual Hollister tradition. They never purchased one from a lot. Instead, they traveled into the forest and cut their own from a grove of grand firs Earl knew, growing along the eastern side of a ridge about 9 miles above the highway. They had made the trip every Christmas since Connie was born. The sky was overcast that morning, but the snow had not begun. The forecast predicted only light flurries later that afternoon. Earl carried a chainsaw and rope in the truck bed. Faye had packed Connie a thermos of hot chocolate and a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Snow started falling around 11. By noon, it had become so heavy that Earl could barely see 20 feet past the windshield. Somewhere between mile markers 7 and 8, his rear tires lost traction on a switchback. The truck slid backward, crossed the shoulder, and dropped into a stand of cedar trees. It did not roll. It stopped at an angle, partly on its wheels and partly against a cedar trunk, nearly as wide as a kitchen table. The cab tilted about 20 degrees, and the rear axle became caught on a stump. Neither Earl nor Connie was injured, but the truck was trapped too firmly to push or rock free. Snow accumulated so quickly that Earl watched his footprints disappear within minutes. Then he made the decision he would question for the rest of his life. He told Connie to remain inside the truck and keep the heater running until the fuel was gone. After that, she was to wrap herself in the wool blanket stored behind the seat. Earl explained that he would walk down to the turnoff leading to the Bracker family's hunting cabin, about 4 miles below them, and return with help. Snow accumulated so quickly that Earl watched his footprints disappear within minutes. Then he made the decision he would question for the rest of his life. He told Connie to remain inside the truck and keep the heater running until the fuel was gone. After that, she was to wrap herself in the wool blanket stored behind the seat. Earl explained that he would walk down to the turnoff leading to the Bracker family's hunting cabin, about 4 miles below them, and return with help. He kissed her forehead, left his coffee thermos and the rest of her hot chocolate, then started down Forest Road 402 through a blizzard that would eventually leave 33 inches of snow in 14 hours. It took Earl 6 hours to reach the Bracker cabin, and he nearly died along the way. When he stumbled through the door, 3 fingers on his right hand were frostbitten. His eyebrows were frozen solid, and he could no longer feel his feet. The Bracker brothers, who were staying at the cabin for opening weekend, wrapped him in blankets and warmed him beside their wood stove. The following morning, after the storm finally eased, they drove him down to the highway. By the time snowplows cleared enough of Forest Road 402 for rescuers to reach the truck, 2.5 days had passed. The cab was empty. The wool blanket and both thermoses were gone. No tracks remained because snow continued falling intermittently for another full day after the main storm. Any footprints Connie had left were buried beneath another 6 inches. The search continued for 9 days. Bonner County Search and Rescue, assisted by Forest Service personnel and volunteers from 3 nearby counties, covered the drainage below the truck toward the highway and above it to the ridgeline. They used dogs. During the only afternoon when the weather allowed it, they sent up a helicopter. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of where she had gone. By the 9th day, officials concluded that Connie had probably left the truck while confused, hypothermic, and disoriented, then died from exposure outside the search area. They gently told Earl and Faye that her body might be discovered after the spring thaw, or might never be found. The Selkirks took people. It was one of the hard realities of living in that country. Spring came, followed by summer. No body was ever recovered. Earl Hollister never traveled Forest Road 402 again. In 1979, he sold the dairy and moved with Faye into a smaller home in Coolin. Faye died of cancer in 1984. Earl lived another 9 years before passing in his sleep in 1993. 2 years after Roy and I found his daughter alive inside that cave. He died without learning the truth. That remains one of the most painful parts of this story. I have accepted it only because Connie eventually made peace with it herself. She mentioned it in a letter from the spring of 1994, after I finally traveled to Coolin and told her that her father had died. Connie wrote that she had known on the exact day it happened. She had been gathering huckleberries in a meadow above the cave when something inside her suddenly went silent. She sat on a fallen log, cried for an hour, and knew with complete certainty that her father was gone. She never explained how she knew. She did not need to. By then,
I had spent enough time with her family to understand that their world operated through signals and connections for which people like us have no words. Roy and I began hunting around Priest Lake in 1970. We were both in our mid-30s, both married, and both working for the county. Roy served on the bridge crew, while I worked roads. We met at a union meeting in 1968 and discovered that we had grown up less than 20 miles apart in eastern Washington. We also shared a preference for cold camps, single-action rifles, and remote country without maintained trails. We hunted deer in October and elk in November. From April through September, we spent most weekends scouting, which usually meant entering the high timber without a fixed destination and learning the country one section at a time. By 1991, Roy and I had hunted the drainage above Priest Lake for 21 years.
we knew that country like the floor plan of a house occupied for decades. The location of every doorway, every creaking board, and how each room connected. That familiarity made what happened in the fall of 1986 seem impossible. Roy and I climbed an unnamed drainage feeding the Upper East Fork of the Priest River, a route we had traveled at least 12 times. The slope was steep, clogged with fallen timber, and ended in a brush-filled basin containing little more than a small spring. I had never seen elk there, and there were barely any deer trails. We chose the drainage because Roy wanted to watch the eastern face of the opposite ridge during the evening movement, and the basin offered the only level ground suitable for a spotting scope. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon, positioned the scope, and Roy began scanning the ridge. I walked toward the spring to filter water for our canteens. That was when I discovered the first footprint. It was pressed into the soft mud beside the spring. 18 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball, 5 clearly defined toes.
The track was so fresh that water still seeped into the heel as I crouched beside it. I called Roy over. He studied the impression without speaking. Roy rarely speculated. He had served in Korea as a forward observer, spent his life around heavy machinery and powerful men, and was difficult to frighten. But he stood there with his hands on his hips, glancing between the footprint and the surrounding forest. After nearly 2 minutes, he said, "We're not the only thing in this basin." Then he packed the spotting scope, and we left. We said nothing during the hike back. Roy did not need to discuss something for both of us to understand it. But that night, beside the truck with the tailgate lowered and the stove burning, he finally spoke. There are stories about this country. I asked what kind. The kind old loggers share when they're drunk enough to tell the truth, but sober enough to keep it within the family. His uncle had logged the Selkirks from the early 1940s until a back injury forced him to stop in 1963. He had described figures standing near clear-cuts at dusk, and strange calls coming from the mountains on windless nights, made by no animal he recognized. Roy had never told me because he had not believed those stories, and did not want me believing them either. But the print beside the spring belonged to neither a bear nor a human, and he had no other explanation. He said we should keep our eyes open and our mouths shut. We did. Over the next 5 years, we discovered more evidence. It was not constant or even frequent, but enough to convince us that something lived in those mountains. Slowly, we began understanding where it traveled and where it remained. We found tracks beside an elk wallow in the spring of 1987, and on a soft gravel bar along an unnamed creek in the summer of 1989. We discovered healthy trees 4 or 5 inches thick, snapped 7 or 8 feet above the ground in ways that could not be explained by wind or heavy snow. Twice, we encountered a thick, musky smell hanging in the still air of canyon bottoms, once during late summer 1988 and again in October 1990. Both times, the hair rose on our arms. Then, in the fall of 1989, we heard them. Roy and I were camped on a saddle between 2 ridges without a fire, lying beneath a tarp in our sleeping bags. Around 2 in the morning, a call rose from the southern drainage.
It began low and climbed into a long, steady tone, lasting 12 or 15 seconds. A similar call answered from another direction, much farther away. They exchanged calls 3 or 4 times. The nearest was perhaps half a mile away. The second was at least 2 miles distant. When the calls ended, the entire forest remained silent for 20 minutes. Then the normal sounds slowly returned, as they do after whatever frightened the animals has moved on. We did not discuss that night for almost a year. In October 1990, while sitting at his kitchen table, Roy finally asked, "You remember the saddle?" I said I did. "I've thought about it every day." I told him I had too. "Whatever they aren't interested in us," he said, working through the idea aloud. "We've hunted their country every fall for 20 years. They could have done anything they wanted to us, but they haven't." Then he added, "They're like elk. They want to be left alone. If we leave them alone, they'll leave us alone." I agreed. It began low and climbed into a long, steady tone, lasting 12 or 15 seconds. A similar call answered from another direction, much farther away. They exchanged calls 3 or 4 times. The nearest was perhaps half a mile away. The second was at least 2 miles distant. When the calls ended, the entire forest remained silent for 20 minutes. Then the normal sounds slowly returned, as they do after whatever frightened the animals has moved on. We did not discuss that night for almost a year. In October 1990, while sitting at his kitchen table, Roy finally asked, "You remember the saddle?" I said I did. "I've thought about it every day." I told him I had too.
"Whatever they aren't interested in us," he said, working through the idea aloud. "We've hunted their country every fall for 20 years. They could have done anything they wanted to us, but they haven't." Then he added, "They're like elk. They want to be left alone. If we leave them alone, they'll leave us alone." I agreed. We never discussed it again until the fall of 1991, when we returned to that basin and discovered something neither of us expected. It was the 3rd week of October. Bow season had ended. Rifle season had begun. and our tags covered the unit containing the basin where we found the first track in 1986. This time, we approached from the north over the ridge instead of climbing the drainage. The route was harder, but it would place us above the basin during the morning movement. We left the truck at 4 on Tuesday morning and hiked by headlamp for 2 hours. By daylight, we had reached the ridge and were moving south with the wind in our faces. By mid-morning, we had seen no elk. There were droppings and rubs, but nothing fresh enough to suggest they were nearby. We decided to descend into an eastern side drainage we had never explored. It dropped from the main ridge through several cliff bands before reaching the East Fork. No maintained trail entered that drainage, and people had little reason to go there. The cliffs were dangerous when wet, while the brush below was thick enough to require an entire day to cross. We did not intend to cross it. We planned to glass the timber pockets between the cliffs for resting elk. That was when we noticed the smoke. A narrow gray column rose from the forest about a quarter-mile below and slightly south of us. It was too small for a structure fire, and even smaller than a campfire built for warmth. It looked like smoke from a carefully controlled flame, the kind used for cooking or staying warm without revealing your location. Roy saw it when I did. He grabbed my arm, and we crouched behind the brush. What followed over the next 4 hours is the part I have replayed most often, so I want to remember the order correctly. We watched the smoke for nearly 20 minutes. It never shifted or grew. It remained a thin gray thread rising through the canopy, evidence of a controlled fire tended by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Finally, Roy whispered, "Glenn, those aren't hunters." He was right. We were far from any legal hunting access. The closest road was 4 miles east and 1,000 feet below us. Whoever tended that fire had reached it by a route at least as difficult as ours. We could have left. We could have stepped away from the ridge, returned home, and Connie Hollister might have remained hidden there for years. Roy and I could have preserved our hunting partnership and our quiet understanding of the mountains without ever knowing the truth. Instead, we moved down the slope toward the smoke. We advanced slowly, stopping whenever a branch cracked beneath our boots. Our rifles remained slung over our shoulders. We were not looking for a confrontation. We approached as hunters approach an unknown campsite deep in the wilderness, carefully, quietly, and prepared for anything. The terrain helped us more than it should have. A strip of relatively level ground followed the hillside at roughly the same elevation as the smoke, allowing us to move along it until we were about 150 yards from the source. Only then did the brush become too thick. Through gaps between the trees, we saw what looked like a shallow opening in the cliff. It was not truly a cave entrance, but a deep overhang formed long ago when a section of stone broke away, leaving a protected space around 20 feet wide and perhaps 10 feet deep. A small fire flickered inside. Bundles that appeared to be made from animal hides were stacked along one side. Near the flames, someone had placed a broad, flat stone as a work surface, with several tools or objects resting on it that I could not identify from where we lay. We also saw someone moving beneath the overhang. The figure was small enough to be either a child or a short adult. It worked around the fire with calm, practiced efficiency, moving like someone who had repeated those tasks thousands of times. Roy and I remained hidden in the brush for nearly an hour. During that time, 2 more figures appeared. The first was a child, perhaps 6 years old, though unusually large for that age. She had dark hair and a controlled physical confidence unlike anything I had seen in a 6-year-old before or since. She moved like a young deer, balanced, economical, and without wasted motion. She carried a bundle of sticks from somewhere beyond the overhang and placed it beside the fire. The smaller adult, whom I later learned was Connie, spoke to her in a language I could not understand. The child answered with a mixture of recognizable English words and sounds that were not English. They were simply a mother and daughter having an easy, familiar conversation. About 15 minutes later, a third figure arrived. This one appeared no older than 2 and was being carried by the older girl. The toddler slept wrapped in what looked like soft hide. The older daughter handed her to Connie, who settled the child against her chest with the effortless familiarity of a mother
who had held children countless times. The older girl then sat beside the fire and began working with a stick and a length of cord. I realized she was weaving something, perhaps a snare or another kind of cordage, but I could not tell for certain. Roy touched my elbow and pointed beyond the overhang. Something moved in a small clearing about 40 feet from the fire. A much larger figure crossed the opening while carrying something dark and heavy over both shoulders. It walked upright. It stood at least 7 feet tall. Dark hair covered it from head to foot, and across his shoulders was a deer. Judging by the size, it was a young black-tailed buck, carried the way a man might carry an animal he had just hauled from the forest. I want to describe honestly what I felt in that moment, because I've returned to it many times. I was not afraid. What I felt was awe, the kind a person experiences when looking directly at something the world has always insisted cannot exist. For 20 years there had been stories, footprints, strange calls, broken trees, and the smell of musk hanging in still air. In one instant, all of it came together in the shape of a living being crossing a clearing with a deer over his shoulders, returning home to his family. Beside me, Roy made a faint sound in his throat, something between a breath and an unfinished word. He did not move. He never reached for his rifle. He simply remained in the brush, watching exactly as I was. The being carried the deer to the front of the overhang, and Connie came out to meet him. He lowered the animal in front of her. For a moment they stood close together. Connie placed her open hand against his chest. He rested one hand across the back of her head, his palm wider than her entire torso. It was clearly a greeting, and there was tenderness in it that I had no framework to understand. He looked down at her. She looked up at him.
Then Connie turned toward the shelter. He lifted the deer again and carried it behind the rocks on the far side of the overhang, disappearing from sight. I assumed there was an area back there where the animal would be processed. After remaining silent for more than an hour, Roy finally whispered, "Glenn, that's a woman." "Yes," I said. "I know." "A white woman?" "Yes." "And those are her children?" "Yes." "And that thing..." He could not finish. I said it for him. "That thing is their father." Roy stayed silent for almost a minute. Then he said, "We need to think very carefully about what we do next." We withdrew through the brush by the same route we had entered, moving slowly and leaving no sign behind. By mid-afternoon, we had returned to the ridgeline. We sat in the cold October sun and tried to decide what should happen. Roy said it first. "We can't tell anyone." I asked why. "Because she has a life down there," he said.
Whatever that life is, she chose it. Or she wasn't given a choice and eventually made one anyway. Bringing the outside world into this won't help her. It'll only make us feel like we've done something. I told him I understood. But we could not simply walk away without knowing more. There was still a chance the woman was being held against her will. There was a chance the children were unsafe. Before deciding whether to protect the secret, we needed to understand exactly what we were protecting. Roy thought about that. He looked toward the drainage where the smoke had risen. Then he said, "You're right." He paused. "We come back tomorrow. We walk to the cave, make sure they know we're coming, and ask." I did not sleep that night. After dark, we hiked back to the truck and drove to a small motel in Priest River. The room had 2 narrow beds and a heater that barely worked. I lay awake, staring at stains on the ceiling and imagining every possible version of the next day. I pictured the being from the clearing meeting us peacefully at the overhang,
I imagined him attacking us. I imagined the woman begging us to help her. I imagined her shouting for us to leave. I thought about the children, especially the youngest one sleeping in her sister's arms beside the fire. And I pictured every way the encounter might go wrong. Roy remained awake in the other bed for most of the night. Neither of us spoke. Around 4 a.m, he brewed coffee in the small plastic machine provided by the motel. We drank it in the dark. Around 5, we put on our boots and drove back to the trailhead. We reached the ridge after sunrise, descended the slope, and returned to the same level bench we had followed the previous day. From there, we moved toward the overhang. When we were about 100 yards away, Roy stopped me. "We should make noise," he said. "We don't want to surprise them." So we deliberately announced ourselves. We snapped a branch. We coughed. We spoke in normal voices about the trail, the weather, and the time. We approached the overhang the way someone approaches an isolated backcountry cabin when they are unsure whether the people inside expect visitors. He came out to meet us when we were still 50 yards away. One moment the trail seemed empty. The next he stepped from behind a cedar tree that I would have sworn could not hide an ordinary man, much less something of his size. He stood across the trail with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. I want to describe him as he appeared in the clear morning light, close enough for me to see his eyes. He was about 7.5 feet tall. His shoulders were broader than the cedar trunk beside him. Hair the color of cured tobacco covered his body. It was darker across his back and shoulders and lighter over his chest and the insides of his arms. His face did not look like the face of an animal. It was heavy and powerful, with a forward brow, a projecting jaw, and a broad, flattened nose. His eyes sat deep beneath the brow. They were intelligent, and the way they watched us was unlike the way any animal watches anything. He was not snarling. His mouth remained closed. His hands hung open at his sides. Even from 50 yards away, we could smell the same musk we had encountered in the canyon the year before. It was not unpleasant, only powerful, warm, organic, and alive, like the smell inside a barn filled with healthy livestock. Roy stopped. I stopped beside him. Our rifles remained strapped across our packs, barrels pointed down, the way we always carried them when we were not actively hunting. I do not know what might have happened if either of us had reached for a weapon. I will remain grateful for the rest of my life that neither of us did. Roy slowly raised both hands, palms open in the universal gesture meaning he intended no harm. I did the same. The being did not react. He remained still, studying us through those deep-set eyes. Then Connie Hollister stepped out from behind him. She had moved down the slope without either of us hearing her. She passed his right side, walked about 10 feet ahead, and stopped.
The expression on her face has never left me. It was not fear. It was not welcome. It was the measured look of a woman who had expected this moment for 15 years and was now evaluating it with everything she had. She was 26. She stood perhaps 5 feet 2 and wore a knee-length tunic made from cured hide. Leggings covered her legs and continued down into soft moccasins. Her dark hair was long and braided away from her face. Her skin showed the weathering of someone who had spent 15 years outside. But she looked healthy. Her eyes were clear, her posture straight, and she had the natural balance of someone used to uneven ground. "You are hunters," she said. "Yes," I answered. "You found us yesterday." "Yes." "And you came back," Roy replied. "We came back because we needed to know whether you're here because you want to be."
He spoke slowly and carefully, as he always did when something mattered. She studied him. Then she said, "I am here because I choose to be." There was no hesitation, no flourish, and no attempt to make the statement dramatic. She simply stated the truth. "My name is Connie Hollister," she continued. I have lived here since I was 11 years old. She paused. You are the first people I have spoken English with in 15 years. If some words take time to return, please forgive me. I need to explain what happened inside me when she said her name. Almost everyone in Bonner County had heard of Connie Hollister. Her disappearance had filled the Bonner County Daily Bee for weeks during the winter of 1976 and 1977. Missing person posters remained in post offices and feed stores for years afterward. I had never known Earl or Faye Hollister personally, but I knew their daughter's name. For all those years, I had carried the awareness that an 11-year-old girl had vanished in those mountains and had never been found. Now she stood before me on a game trail above the east fork of the Priest River, alive at 26, with a 7-foot being behind her like a protector, who had no need to protect her because she clearly did not need guarding. Roy understood a moment after I did. Very quietly he said, "Connie, your father." Her expression changed for the first time. Her chin trembled. "Is he alive?" "The last we heard, he was," Roy said. "He lives in Coolin." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, though no tears had fallen. "And my mother?" Roy lowered his voice. "I'm sorry. Your mother died in 1984. Cancer." Connie received the news in silence. She did not cry. She nodded slowly, like someone hearing news she had spent years preparing to accept. "Thank you," she said. "I have wondered for a long time." She turned toward the being behind her and made a low sound in her throat, rising and falling in a way I could never reproduce. He answered with a similar tone. They were communicating. When she faced us again, she said, "He is asking what you intend to do." I answered honestly, "We have no plan. We came to hunt elk. We saw the smoke and wanted to make sure no one needed help." Connie remained quiet. Behind her, the being shifted his weight. Throughout the entire conversation, his eyes had never left us. He watched the way a man might watch a snake near his porch, with calm, steady attention and no unnecessary hostility. "There is a price for what you have seen," Connie said. Roy and I answered together. "We won't tell anyone." A slight smile crossed her face. "That is the price." Then she continued, "You may come to the cave. You may eat with us and stay the night. I would like to hear about my father and tell you how I came to live here. But once you leave, you must never return unless invited. And while we are alive, you will tell no one about us. Do you understand?"
We understood. We gave her our word. She nodded. Then she spoke to the being behind her. He answered in the same low language. "He says you may come," she translated. "He also says you will walk first." So we went ahead. He remained about 20 paces behind us, with Connie beside him. The 100 yards between the trail and the overhang were the strangest 100 yards I have ever walked. I could sense him behind me, but I could not hear him. A man of that size crossing a slope covered in dead branches should have been audible from 50 yards away. He made no sound. He moved through the forest like water through a creek bed, disturbing nothing. At the overhang, the older daughter stood beside the fire with a toddler on her hip. Neither moved as we approached. The toddler watched us with eyes the color of dark honey. "Let me introduce my family," Connie said. She crossed to the older child and placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is Wren. She is 8 years old." She speaks English and her father's language. She taught me much of his language, and now she is teaching her sisters. Wren studied us. Her face blended both parents. She had the finer bone structure of Connie's family, combined with the stronger brow and broader nose of her father's people. Thick, dark hair fell past her shoulders, and her eyes were the color of strong tea. In clear English, marked by a faint rhythm I could not place, she said, "Hello, my mother has explained hunters to me. You smell like truck oil and metal. I will get used to it." No one had ever greeted me that way before.
no one has since. I told her I was pleased to meet her. She nodded like an adult. The toddler in her arms was Sage. She was 2 years and 4 months old. Connie later explained that Sage had inherited more of her father's solid build, but had her mother's pale skin, light brown hair, and coloring. In nearly every visible way, she looked like a small, sturdy human child.
Her hands, however, were far thicker than those of any toddler I had seen. Later, when curiosity made her grip my index finger, the strength of it brought tears to my eyes. Inside, sleeping, is Juniper, Connie said. She is 4. She had a fever yesterday and has been resting. You will meet her later. Then Connie turned toward the being who had escorted us down the slope. She placed one hand on his arm. And this is their father. She looked at us. His true name is a sound from his language that I cannot reproduce in English. The closest sound I can make is Rue. She said the name softly with clear affection. When he heard it, he lowered his head slightly. He understood. Whatever he was, he recognized his name. Roy stepped forward. He removed his rifle and placed it on a flat rock near the shelter, then set his pack beside it.
Facing Rue, he extended his right hand palm up, the way someone offers a hand to an unfamiliar dog. I placed my rifle and pack down and did the same. Rue looked at our hands. Then he looked at Connie. She made a quiet sound. Rue came closer, slowly, as though reaching towards something he did not want to startle. He extended his right hand and lowered his palm across both of ours.
His single hand covered both of our hands completely. His skin was warmer than human skin. The hair across the back of his hand was coarse but clean. He held us that way for about 3 seconds. Then he withdrew and stepped back. A deep sound came from his chest, somewhere between a word and a hum. Connie translated, "He says you are welcome beside our fire." That was the beginning of the 3 days we spent with them. I want to tell Connie's story now, because she shared it during that first night beside the flames. Sage slept against her chest. Wren rested beside her with her head on Connie's leg. Rue sat just beyond the firelight, where he preferred to remain while strangers were present. He listened, but did not join. By then, Juniper had awakened and been brought outside. She was 4, though small for her age, with dark eyes, her father's brow, and Connie's mouth. After one look at me, she apparently decided I was harmless. She spent most of the evening sitting in my lap and turning the brass buttons of my hunting coat between her thick little fingers. Picture that scene. A 4-year-old girl who was half Sasquatch sat on my lap beside a fire beneath a rock overhang in the Selkirk Mountains, while her mother explained how she had come to live there. I will remember it until I die. Connie said she stayed inside the stranded truck for about an hour before making her decision. Once Earl shut off the engine, the cab cooled quickly. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket, watched snow build against the windows, and waited for him to return. She was not frightened at first. Earl Hollister had raised her not to panic in the woods. But after an hour, snow had risen beyond the windows, and the remaining light inside the cab had turned dim and gray. She started thinking about the cold. She wondered how long the fuel would last. She pictured her father struggling through the storm toward the Bracker cabin, and realized that even if he reached it, help might still be many hours away. She decided she could not remain in the truck. She chose to walk. Connie made it only about 300 yards before losing her direction. The snow fell so heavily that she could not see 10 feet ahead. She believed the road was downhill. She tried to return to it. Instead, she walked uphill. By the time she understood her mistake, dense timber surrounded her. Snowdrifts rose above her knees. She could no longer feel her toes, and she was beginning to understand that she might die there. She sat beside a cedar tree, pulled the wool blanket over her head, and prayed. She prayed in the simple Methodist way her mother had taught her. She asked God to send someone to find her. Then she waited. Someone did come, but not anyone she could have imagined. The first thing she noticed was the smell.
It was the same warm musk Roy and I would later encounter in the canyon in 1988, only much stronger, closer, and unmistakably alive. Connie lifted the edge of the blanket. A being stood in the falling snow 6 feet away. It was not Rue. This one was older and female, judging by the narrower build. Gray hair marked her muzzle and chest, and her eyes resembled smooth river stones. The older female crouched until she was level with Connie. She did not speak. She did not try to touch her. Instead, she extended one open hand, palm upward, and made a gentle sound deep in her throat.
Connie said it was the most motherly sound she had ever heard. She never understood exactly why she trusted the hand. She was 11, alone in a blizzard, slowly freezing to death. Before her crouched a creature she had no name for, silently holding out its hand. Yet something inside her, an instinct older than conscious thought, told her this was the answer to her prayer. She placed her small hand inside the larger one. The female lifted her from the snow, pressed Connie against her chest beneath the long, coarse hair, and carried her away from the storm into a part of the mountains no human survey had ever mapped. Over time, Connie learned that the female's name was a sound she eventually shortened to Ma. Ma was Rue's mother. At that time, she led a small family group of 7, 3 adults and 4 juveniles, whose territory crossed the spine of the Selkirk Mountains. Their winter shelter was located inside a deep cave system, about 11 miles from where Ma found Connie. The cave contained several connected chambers. A natural thermal seep warmed the innermost sections, keeping them above freezing even during the harshest winters. That was where Ma carried Connie.
Connie remembered only pieces of the journey. She recalled the warmth of Ma's body, the strong musky scent, and the feeling of being held against a chest so large it felt like a fireplace. For the first time since the truck had gone over the embankment, she believed she would survive. The family accepted her immediately. She said those first weeks were the strangest of her life. She was a small human child living among enormous hominids who spoke a different language, ate unfamiliar food, and had no experience raising someone like her. But Ma had decided Connie belonged with them. As matriarch, Ma's decisions became the family's decisions. They kept Connie warm. They fed her dried meat, roots, and a starchy tuber she described as tasting like a cross between a sweet potato and a chestnut. They watched over her constantly. The younger members, 2 males and 2 females, were fascinated by her. One young male, whom Connie later estimated would have been about 14 in human years, became her constant companion. That young male was Rue. Connie learned their language gradually. Being only 11 helped. Her mind was still naturally suited for language learning. She first recognized the emotional tones, then the clicks and deep chest sounds that acted as words. She eventually realized their language worked nothing like English. Pitch and duration carried meanings that English expresses with grammar. After 1 year, she understood most conversations. After 2 years, she could answer them. After 5 years, English itself felt unfamiliar. like trying to sing a song she had not heard in years. She never tried to escape. I asked her directly that first night whether she had ever considered finding the highway and returning to her parents. She looked across the fire and answered quietly, "Glenn, I thought about it every day during the first year."
Every night I cried for my mother. But by the second winter I understood something. She paused. The family decided I belonged to them. Not the way someone owns a prisoner. The way a grandmother claims a grandchild. I wasn't imprisoned. I was cared for. They fed me, kept me warm, taught me, and loved me. By the third year, I didn't want to leave. By the fifth, I never thought about leaving. They were simply my family. She and Rue became a couple during her late teens. She gave no intimate details, and I never asked. Some things were not meant for two old hunters sitting beside a fire. She only said Rue had always been patient. Their relationship developed slowly over several years until it felt completely natural. She believed it was more genuine than anything she remembered reading about as a child.
Ma approved. Rue's father approved. The family accepted their union quietly, just as any family would. Ren was born in the spring of 1983, inside the deepest chamber of the winter cave, with Ma assisting. Juniper followed in late summer of 1987. Sage arrived during early summer of 1989. Every pregnancy was difficult because the children grew faster and were larger than human babies. Even so, all 3 births went smoothly. Ma delivered each child. Connie believed Ma had helped bring dozens of babies into the world and understood childbirth better than any doctor she could have reached. Ma died peacefully of old age during the winter of 1990. No one knew exactly how old she was, but the family believed she had lived through more than 100 winters. She passed in her sleep, with her family gathered around her. After Ma's death, the family divided.
Rue's father led the older juveniles north into Canada to join relatives in the Purcell Range, where one of his daughters had already formed a family. Rue, Connie, and their 3 daughters remained in the Selkirks. They spent winters inside the deep cave and moved between seasonal camps along the East Fork drainage. The overhang where Roy and I discovered them was their autumn camp, used while drying meat and gathering the final berries before returning to the winter shelter. Connie told us all of this in one long conversation that lasted from full darkness until well after midnight. One by one, the girls fell asleep. First Sage against Connie's chest, then Juniper in my lap.
Finally, Ren curled beside her mother. Rue never left his place just beyond the firelight. He listened quietly to every word. From time to time, he made a low sound deep in his chest, the way an old husband quietly agrees while hearing a familiar story once again. He understood enough English to follow everything Connie was telling us. He understood English but never spoke it. Connie said that when they were younger, Rue had tried to form English words with his mouth and throat. His vocal system simply could not produce the necessary sounds. Eventually, he stopped trying, and they accepted his language as the one they would use together. When the fire had burned down to embers, Connie told us it was time to sleep. Roy and I could spread our bedrolls along the wall opposite the family's sleeping area. Rue would remain at the entrance, as he always did, placing himself between his family and the outside world. Connie said we would be safer inside that cave than we had ever been anywhere else. She was right. I slept more deeply that night than I had in 10 years. I woke only once when Juniper began coughing. In the dim glow of the coals, I saw Rue turn toward his daughter. Connie reached up from her bedding and touched his arm.
I understood without explanation that the outside world would never allow this family to continue living as they did if anyone discovered them. The following morning, they showed us their daily life. Wren took me to the creek to explain how they caught fish. She moved ahead along a game trail so faint that I could barely follow it, crossing the rough ground with the natural ease of a child who has spent all 8 years of her life in the mountains. Connie had told me Wren was small by her father's standards. Even so, she was already taller and broader than most human 8-year-olds. Her hands were large. Her feet were wider than mine. She walked barefoot over the frozen trail without reacting to the cold. As we went, she described the trout in the creek, where they gathered, and how Rue had taught her to catch them by standing motionless in the freezing water and waiting.
Wren said her hands were not yet as fast as his, but she was improving. By the next summer, she believed she would catch one alone. She showed me the fishing pool, the rack where they smoked fish they did not eat immediately, and a stone Rue had placed near the top of the pool to slow the current and create a resting place for trout. She explained everything with the serious pride of a child showing a visitor around her family's farm. Without thinking, I asked what she wanted to become when she grew up. It was a sort of question a 56-year-old man from my world automatically asked a child. Wren stopped and looked at me. "I will do what my mother does," she said. "I will raise my children somewhere in these mountains. I will teach them their grandfather's language and their grandmother's language. I will care for my family." Then she asked, "Did you mean something else?" I told her no, but I understood that I had asked the question incorrectly. In Wren's world, growing up did not mean becoming something different. It meant becoming more fully what you already were. She was already a daughter of the mountains. Her future would deepen that identity, not replace it. Roy spent the morning with Rue. I was not present for most of it, but Roy later described everything carefully. He rarely shared his thoughts lightly, and what he told me changed how I saw Rue forever. Rue took him to a flat area near camp where he kept his tools. There were only a few. He had stone scrapers made from chert gathered in the high country, with edges Roy said were as sharp as butcher knives. There were polished bone awls shaped from deer or elk legs, a wooden mallet, and neat coils of cord twisted from plant fibers. Roy said the rope was as strong as nylon. Rue showed each object with the patience of one craftsman introducing another to his workbench. He let Roy hold the tools and test their edges. They communicated mostly through gestures and low sounds. Connie came over once or twice to translate specific questions. Roy later said Rue was a maker. The care used to create the tools, the way he stored them, and the pride with which he handled them reminded Roy of his father, a skilled welder in Spokane during the 1940s, who treated his tools like sacred objects. Roy said calling Rue intelligent was not enough. The word was too small. Rue was a person. A complete person of another kind, raised differently and speaking another language, but still a person in every meaningful sense. That afternoon, Connie, the girls, and I sat outside the overhang in the sunlight. Connie braided Wren's hair. Sage played with a small wooden elk Rue had carved. Juniper, recovering from her fever, leaned against me and asked question after question about the outside world. She wanted to know about cars, how they worked, how fast they traveled, and why they produced the smell Connie remembered as the one unpleasant part of her earlier life. She asked about schools, other children, what they ate, and whether they were kind. I answered as honestly as I could. I told her my world contained good things and difficult things. Most children could be kind sometimes, while a few were never kind at all. One of the hardest parts of childhood was learning which was which. Juniper listened with Connie's serious dark eyes beneath Rue's heavy brow. At the end, she asked whether I had children. I told her my wife and I had never been blessed with any. She thought for a moment, placed her hand over mine, and said, "Then maybe today you can pretend we are yours." She spoke with the innocence of a 4-year-old, unaware of how deeply the words would affect me. I had to look away toward the trees before answering, "Juniper, I would like that very much." That night was our second evening with them. Rue had taken the older girls to inspect a line of snares near the creek. Sage slept on a folded hide beside the fire. Connie and I sat outside, watching the last light move across the cliffs. Roy was inside preparing his pack for our departure. After a while, Connie spoke. "Glenn, when you leave tomorrow, will you keep your promise?" "Yes," I said. I told her I had spent my life keeping my word and would not begin breaking it at 56. And Roy? Roy more than me. He has protected family secrets since childhood. Nothing could force one out of him. She nodded. "Then I want to ask one more thing." She wanted us to return. Not soon and not regularly, but occasionally when the season was right. She wanted someone from the outside world to know they were there. Her daughters would grow older and ask questions. Wren already had many. Connie had told them about her parents, the dairy farm, the church, and the lake. But those were only the memories of an 11-year-old child. She wanted her daughters eventually to have a trusted friend who could explain the outside world honestly without trying to take them away. I promised to return whenever she asked. She said she would send word. When I asked how, she smiled. "We have ways. You will know." Roy and I left the next morning. Wren walked with us to the ridge carrying a small pack she had woven from bark fibers. Inside were gifts. For Roy, there was a small obsidian blade shaped by Rue. For me, there was a wooden carving Rue had made the previous winter. A woman holding a child. I asked Wren to thank him. She said he could already hear me. Rue was more than a mile away in the timber, but his hearing was strong enough to pick up our voices. She said he was glad we had come, and glad we were leaving. When I asked what she meant, Wren looked up at me with her serious dark eyes. "He is glad you came, because my mother needed to speak with people from the other side. She has needed that for years. But he is glad you are leaving, because we cannot remain anywhere long after outsiders discover it. Tomorrow we will move before the snow. By the time you reach your truck, we will already be gone." I asked where they would go. She smiled with the same private expression as her mother. "Where the mountains tell us." During the next 34 years, I returned 4 times. Every visit came through an invitation from Connie, delivered by methods I will not explain because they belong to her family. Each meeting happened in a different location and lasted no more than 3 days. Roy joined me twice. In 2003, his heart began causing problems and he could no longer make the journey. After that, I went alone. He died in 2007 before I could take him on the final visit Connie wanted him to make.
that remains one of the private sorrows I have carried beside the larger griefs of my life. Across those visits, I watched Connie's daughters grow up. Ren is 42 now. She bonded with a young male from a family living in the Cabinet Mountains of northwestern Montana. They have 4 children. The oldest is 19 and has begun traveling between his mother's territory and a related family group in the Salmo Priest Wilderness near the Canadian border. According to Connie, Ren has become a calm and steady presence within her family, the kind of woman whose presence settles everyone around her. By her father's standards, she remains small at only 6 feet tall, but she has Connie's intelligence and Rue's patience. Together, those qualities have made her a bridge between different family groups. Exactly as her mother once hoped. Juniper is 38 now. She chose a mate later in life, another hybrid from a different family group. Together they have 1 daughter, born in 2021. The child carries less of the old blood than either parent. But Juniper says she inherited Connie's warm laugh and Rue's calm, steady eyes. Juniper never left the Selkirks. She rarely travels beyond the country where she grew up. Sage, now 36, is the youngest and the one who looks the most human. She is also the daughter I have thought about the most. At 19, Sage left the mountains alone. She reached a highway, accepted a ride from a passing logger, and blended in so naturally that he never questioned who she was. He dropped her in Sandpoint. Her first stop was the public library. She asked the librarian for books about the world. She's been reading ever since. Today she lives in a small apartment in Coeur d'Alene and works as a baker at a place I will not name. She has never told anyone her full story. Twice a year she returns to the mountains to visit her family. As far as I know, she is the only daughter who has built a life in both worlds. Connie once wrote that watching Sage make that choice was both the hardest and proudest moment of her life as a mother. Rue is still alive. Age has slowed him, and gray now covers his shoulders and chest. But he remains the head of the family. He still sleeps closest to the entrance of every shelter, and still provides for those he loves. I have met him 5 times over the years. The last time in the fall of 2022, we sat across the fire together for hours. At one point, he reached across the flames and rested his enormous hand over mine. We stayed that way silently for nearly a minute. Without speaking, I knew we had become friends. Connie is 60 now. Her hair has turned gray at the temples, but she remains the quiet strength holding her family together. She has 7 grandchildren. She has spent 49 of her 60 years deep in the forests, building a life that, by every measure I know, has been a good one. 6 months ago, she wrote and told me the story could finally be shared. Her oldest grandson had begun asking questions about the human side of his family, just as Juniper once had, and just as Sage eventually did before leaving the mountains. Connie said they were finally ready for the world to know they exist, not to find them. She made that absolutely clear. She does not want maps, locations, or winter shelters revealed. She only wants people to know they are real, and that they are nothing like the frightening legends. Somewhere across northern Idaho, western Montana, and southern British Columbia, families like hers still live quietly beyond the edges of our world. They were there before the first settlers arrived. They will likely remain long after the last logging road disappears. I am 76 years old now. My eyesight has faded. My knees ache. I no longer hunt. and I have not returned to the high country in 2 years. I doubt I ever will. Connie says our next meeting, if there is one, may have to happen somewhere lower where she can come to me.
I told her I would meet her anywhere. I still do not fully understand everything I witnessed. I spent my life working road crews and hunting. I believed the world was simple. What I found in those mountains was not. I found a family. A woman who lost one life and built another. A man, because that is exactly what Rue is, who hunted for his children, guarded his family, and years later reached across a fire to hold the hand of an old hunter. I watched 3 daughters become women, living lives the world never imagined. Now the world will imagine them. Because Connie Hollister asked me to tell the truth. Because after 34 years, I owed her that. And because my partner Roy carried the secret until his death, and the world deserves to know what he saw. Connie Hollister disappeared in a blizzard in December 1976. She was 11. In October 1991, 2 elk hunters found her alive. By then she had 3 daughters, a husband who loved her, and a hidden life high in the Selkirk Mountains. We made her a promise. We kept it. Roy carried that promise to his grave. I am telling it now because Connie herself finally said the time had come. The mountains are still listening. The families who live beyond the roads are still there, still watching, still raising their children, still living the ancient lives that existed before we arrived and will remain after we are gone. I am grateful I lived long enough to tell their story.